Hi, my name is Ron Dulek, and I'm the John R. Miller Professor at the University of Alabama. Garrett invited me to put together a 20-minute video talking about business communications. At the outset, let me tell you, I've been teaching a long time, and one of the things that I've learned is that students never complain if you let them go from class a little bit early, so we won't go the full 20 minutes. Garrett also gave me free rein as to what to talk about, teaching, research, or anything else, so long as it's in some way related to ABC. And as I pondered what to talk about, I started kind of looking back historically at my experience in communication and came to a rather startling realization. Next year will be my 50th year of teaching business or managerial communication. I started teaching it when I was a graduate student at Purdue in 1971 and moved to Alabama as a faculty member in 1977 and have taught it at Alabama ever since. That's a bit frightening. As I thought about as I went back into history and thought about those 50 years, and I asked myself this question. If I had to summarize those 50 years in one word, what would that word be? And to my kind of pleasure and surprise, the word that popped into mind was joy. I've extremely enjoyed teaching business communication or managerial communication or corporate communication, whatever the various terms are and the various dimensions of it are. But joy would be the word that I would use to summarize those 49 plus years. And so as I put this together, I started thinking I'd like to share a couple of just joyful moments that I've had in the classroom and or the research arena, and that in sharing those joyful moments, maybe there are lessons here, but I'm not going to be pedantic and point those out. You extract those if you think there's a lesson here. For me, these were just moments of joy. My first joyful experience I want to talk about occurred about 5 years ago in a classroom filled with seniors who are graduating from the university. And one of the things that I worry about in terms of teaching communication, I worry the students see the value of the participation and of the projects, but I worry that they don't see that there is a knowledge base behind there. So to counter that, what I started doing is giving the students 2 tests during the semester. And they're multiple choice or fill in the blank tests. And I treat these as both content-based and also as kind of fun. I always tease the students and say, if you want to, I'll curve it in the following way. I'll take the highest grade and move that grade up to 100 and give everybody that many points. And so if you all will just answer the same way, you'll all get 100. And I'm aware of research in game theory that says this can't happen. Well, about 5 years ago, it was the second test, and the students were about 2 weeks away from graduation. And I came to class early, and they were all there, so I distributed the test. And then I said that I was going to run over and get some papers from my office, and I'd be back, but they could do the test while I was gone. And when I came back, the students were all, and this was a class of 60 students, were all sitting with their arms folded like this, sitting straight up and smiling at me. And on the table were all of their exams, and they had all answered one question the same way and left everything else blank. And my first reaction inside my head was to curse at them and say, take the blankety blank test. I then realized I just couldn't believe this had happened. So I said, was anyone in here strong-armed into doing this? And one young woman said, I initially didn't want to do it, but I was talked into it. I did it of my own free will. Everybody else just sat there. I said, I need to think about this for a minute. And I started going through my head as to what to do. One side of me said, take the test, academics, etc. The other side said, this is going to be a memory that will be imprinted in their brains the rest of their lives. This is how they're going to remember the University of Alabama. And so after weighing one and the other, I finally said, you all got 100 on the test. And there were whoops and shouts and screams, and some students came and shook my hand, and they piled out of the classroom. I was amazed how the social networks work so quickly here. Within an hour, every faculty member in the business school and every other student in the business school and probably every staff member in the business school heard about what had happened. A number of faculty came to see me, and they were split about 50-50 as to the appropriateness of what I had done. Some of the faculty congratulated me and said, yeah, this was the way to do it. The students trusted you and so forth. The other half said that I had, undercut academic integrity. And one faculty member in particular came, and she's a very good friend, and she apologized for the students disrespecting me. And my response was, I said, I didn't feel disrespected. I felt trusted. I said, I don't think the students would have taken this risk if they didn't trust me. And she said, well, I think in the real world, they'd all get fired for doing this. And I thought about that for a minute, and my response was, my response has shaped now the way I view university teaching. My response was, this isn't the real world. This is a university. If the students want real world experience, I got a great way for them to do it. Rather than spending 4 years here and paying tuition, go out and get a job. That'll get you 4 years of real world experience. Our job is to provide some practical knowledge, but we do it in an environment that's different than the real world. And it's led to me to realize that what I now stress more than I previously had in my communications classes is for students to take chances. Experiment on a presentation, experiment on a report, respond differently in class than I expect you to. Don't just give me back a rote answer. And because that's what a university really is. It's a place where you can make mistakes and the consequences of that mistake aren't too severe. You ought to make mistakes in the university because that's part of how you learn. And that experience has really, really shaped how I teach communication since that point. The second experience that I've had, and I shared an early version of this exercise at an ABC conference many years ago, is I give the students a nickel. Earlier in my career, I would give them a nickel the first day of class and tell them that I would collect the nickel at graduation. And then I give them a brief lecture about the nickel, and I call it the coin of business success. And each nickel, I'm careful to give them nickels that have Monticello on the back side of it. And I talk about Monticello representing the strategy of business success, that you have to have a strategy to be successful. You don't just stumble into it. And I give them a brief lecture about how Jefferson was almost obsessed at building Monticello, how he almost went bankrupt in the process and so forth, and that's what strategy is really about. I then have them flip their nickels and talk briefly about Jefferson. Now, I admit that I admit to the students that I'm giving them a watered down version of Jefferson because I don't want to get into the negatives at this point, but they do exist. And that I particularly want to stress the Declaration of Independence and what it represented. And I point out that many scholars regard the Declaration of Independence as the most influential secular document ever written. And so I talk of it like that. And then I point out that to me, the head side of the coin represents the people and the communication side of business success. In other words, business success, you have to have both sides of the coin. You have to have a strategy, but you also have to have people and successfully communicate to be successful. Historically, what I did up until 5 years ago is I then would actually show up at graduation and collect the nickel, and it gave a kind of coherence to the whole class. And then I like the idea of having the class associated with graduation and a time of great happiness and joy. 5 years ago, one of my students we didn't connect at graduation. He was there, but I missed him. And a year later, he sent me his nickel, and he included a note that talked about what the nickel had done over the last year. Specifically, this nickel, he had graduated from the university. He had moved, the nickel moved to Houston. It got a job with an oil and gas company and did a brief tour in the Middle East as part of his travels. And I realized as I read this student's note that I was really missing an opportunity with this nickel metaphor. And so what I've done is I moved this exercise, rather than doing it on the first day of class, I now do it on the last day of class. And I tell the students that they have 5 years to get the nickel back to me. And that the nickel shouldn't just sit in an office. It should have experiences, and that kind of thing. I've been astounded how that little exercise has kept me in touch with many of my students. And I've been pleased by finding out what my students are doing over these 5 years. Let me share two emails which I've received from the students that will show you what they do, and it'll show you the value, I think, of this exercise. This first email came from an MBA student who never talked in class. He was always very, very quiet. He sat in the back of the class. I didn't think I'd ever reached him. I was extremely honored that he sent me this note. Dr. Dulek, hope all is well. I'm currently in Syria on a relief mission with a group called Free Burma Rangers, giving aid to refugees fleeing Bugaz, the final stronghold of ISIS. We've given food, water, and other supplies and medical care to over 15,000 so far this month. We've been working closely with the Syrian Democratic Forces, a group of Arab and Kurdish militia fighters, to move around the area. I lost my nickel, but was able to pick up this coin in its place. It's a Daesh, a 25-cent piece. At its peak, ISIS controlled most of northern Syria and a large chunk of Iraq. This coin shows their sophistication, as they printed their own currency, had a standing fighting force, and even had some manufacturing operations. This trip has been a lesson in communication, and I've thought of your class often as I'm in charge of our group's radio comms, and have observed our leader navigate the tricky diplomatic waters for getting us access, permissions, etc. I hope to be able to visit Tuscaloosa soon. Isn't that a cool application of our class material? The second email came also within the last year. I hope you've been well. I was in your GBA capstone class spring of 2017, and you gave us a nickel and told us to tell you where it's been. I can't remember the exact time frame you said, but I pulled that nickel out of my purse today, and it reminded me of that day. Since I graduated, that nickel went home to Murrells Inlet, South Carolina, and that summer it went with me to my best friend's wedding in Orange, California. It moved to Chattanooga, Tennessee with me. From there, it's gone with me everywhere I've been. It spent 6 weeks in Ontario, California on a truck lot working for UPS. From there, it went to Hollywood, Big Bear Lake, and all over the San Gabriel Mountains. Then the nickel went on a weekend trip to Helen, Georgia. It's been to Knoxville, Tennessee a few times, and went on a girls' trip to Asheville, North Carolina. Last month, it went with me on a trip to Arizona, Phoenix, up to skiing in Flagstaff, a day at the Grand Canyon, and a stunning drive through Sedona. When you gave us those nickels, I really didn't understand, but looking at it tonight, I got it. I sat down and thought about all the incredible places I've been since graduation, and I sobbed. I've been feeling frustrated and like I've been spinning my wheels and that my life doesn't look like what I thought it would. But holding that nickel reminded me of everything I've accomplished and brought me back to a place of gratefulness and pride in all that I've done. So thank you for giving me the most important nickel I've ever had in my possession. I encourage you to, whether it's a nickel or some other form of gift that you can give the students to stay in contact with them, borrow this approach. I promise you it will be as rewarding to your career as anything you'll do, anything you publish, any content you'll teach. I strongly urge you to do a version of this exercise. The last point of joy I want to share actually occurred just a couple of weeks ago. I was teaching STEM MBAs, and these were second-year MBAs who are supposed to graduate this semester, or who are graduating this semester. And it was the Thursday before spring break. And this was actually an early evening class. And we were into the COVID-19 things that was starting up, but the university had not yet made decisions as to what it was going to do. And the students came to class, and they pointed out to me, because everybody was guessing what was going to happen, and they said, this is probably going to be their last physical class at Alabama. So I pulled aside one of the students, and I gave him my credit card, and I said, I want you to go to the grocery store and buy as much Corona beer as you can. Buy enough for the whole class. And this was a group of about 70 students. And he said, can I take somebody with me? And I said, sure. So he grabbed a fellow student, and they went over, and they came back, and they got back before class started, and they brought in these cases of Corona beer and stacked them at the front of the class. And I said to the students, I said, we're doing class. And so I taught their class with these cases of Corona behind me. And when we finished, I said, you know, there's a strong possibility that you may not get a normal graduation to celebrate, so we're going to celebrate right now. And so I passed out the Coronas, and the students were as excited as if we had had a U.S. senator come to speak at a graduation. One student asked if he could take a selfie, and I agreed. I said, but it's not about me. And let me share with you, I think you'll see the joy in the students. Here are my students celebrating their graduation. I've gotten thank you notes. I have gotten various emails about it was the highlight of their academic career. A number of them have written me telling me they saved their bottles. Others have written saying they saved their bottle caps. It was a spontaneous idea. It was a little bit on the edge, and I would do it again in a moment's notice if given the opportunity. I think sometimes, my friend Jim Sukin used to talk about how he worried about education being that we have a pot of knowledge here, and our job is only to move that pot into this other pot called a student or a reader or something like that. And I really think education is more than that, especially business communication. We have such flexibility in terms of what we can teach. We can cover so many different contents and so much different, really, really important content and important ideas that the students need to at least ponder. And so as I approach this 50 years of teaching communication, if asked for that one word, it would be joy. It would be joy. And I hope that the next 50 years are as joyful as the first 50 years. And I hope that all of you find joy likewise in teaching communication. These are tough times, but just change is going to ultimately be beneficial to us. And we're going to figure out ways of connecting with students in brand new and even better ways. And we're going to do better research than ever. And may we all ultimately, at the end of our careers, say that our careers were joyful. Thank you.